Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C. for the rollout of providing for the Common Defense, which is the National Defense Strategy Commission, what some old-timers would refer to as the National Defense Panel. And we're honored to have with us the two men who chaired this great endeavor, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who was the former policy chief of the Pentagon during the Bush administration, affiliated with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and Admiral Gary Roughead, former Chief of Naval Operations, now with the Hoover Institution in sunny California. It's an honor, and both of you also have a SICE affiliation, if I'm correct, right? So it was really amazing. It was like old home week here at SICE with Dr. Cohen, of course, the Vice Dean here, moderating this. Ambassador Edelman, let me start with you. Talk to us. Your charter from Congress early this year was assess the national defense strategy. What are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And some pointers on how to actually end up with better defense strategy at the end of it. Both of you testified up on the Hill yesterday in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Talk to us a little bit about what the administration and the Defense Secretary got right, and where do you think is room for improvement?
So, Vago, the strategy, I think we believed unanimously, is appropriately nested under the national security strategy, which sees us in a long-term strategic competition with Russia and China, particularly China, and prioritizes those competitions as at the head of the tasks that face the Department of Defense. We largely agree with that. We think that's an appropriate redirection of the department. Where we found some issues to be resolved were the question of how well resourced the strategy is, and whether it's supported by analytic base and by appropriate operational concepts that would give one confidence that the strategy can be executed in the future. And that's where we focused our attention, and where we hope that the Congress will focus its attention going forward in trying to get the administration to make sure that there's a reality behind the strategy and it's not just a paper document.
And as a former CNO, sir, what were some of your takeaways?
Well, I think Eric nailed it with regard to the overall context, but I would add the one thing I think that's important in the NDS, and we highlighted in our report as well, is beginning the preparation for the new technologies that are going to be part of warfare of the future. Similarly, getting a focus on those is important, but what the Commission commented upon was the importance of having to change some of the processes and having those introduced more quickly. The other aspect that both documents reference also is the importance of our allies and what that contribution is. But it's also important that we begin to think through how we enhance that cooperative relationship, particularly with our high-end allies, and then how will that potentially lead into the co-production of some of these new technologies into the systems that our young people are going to be using in the future.
Your talk with Dr. Cohen is up online. I believe it's going to be on the SICE website, and you listed some of those technologies: artificial intelligence, autonomy, quantum communications, quantum computing. Folks don't tend to think about the communications part of it, which is actually potentially some of the most game-changing capabilities. Eric, let me come to you. You've participated on each one of these. There have been a lot of consistent themes that have been highlighted. You guys talked about some of the great power challenges in 10. You stressed it again in 14. And now in this report, you use some of the most terrifying language, actually, that the United States could be subjected to a humiliating defeat at the hands of one of these adversaries. There are those who've also talked about, we tend to think of conflict as linear. We'll hold off the Russians and deal with the Chinese unless the Chinese and the Russians want to do it simultaneously to you, and then you have an opportunist who jumps in as well, whether it's Iran or North Korea. Talk to us about whether or not was the language designed to sort of shock the system, and do people in the ecosystem understand how dire this challenge actually is, instead of looking at you as a little bit of a chicken little?
I think that one of the things that struck all of the members of the Commission as we dug into this was that the statement that Secretary Hagel made some years ago about the rapidly declining margin of superiority that the U.S. Still maintained over its potential great power adversaries had been shrinking even more rapidly, I think, than some of us had realized. So one of the things we wanted to do is make sure that both the Congress and the American public are aware that we are no longer in an era of unmatched U.S. dominance, that in fact we now are seeing our margin for error shrinking. So we definitely wanted to make sure that people are aware of this change of circumstance and focus appropriately on it. I think it's important to stress that we're not there yet. I mean, we don't argue that we're at the point of losing a war today. We're really saying that unless something changes on the current trajectory and the trends we see in the future, we could find ourselves in that place. So now we have, the paradox of prevision, as it were, which is that having sounded the alarm, there are things we can do to correct that and put ourselves on a different course.
That was very, very poetic, by the way. It was. Let me ask you, sir. How long deterrence works if your adversary believes that you have the capability to deter them, right? And the Japanese miscalculated, but in early 1941, the general staff told the political leadership, when asked, can you do it this year? They said, yes, this year is the first year that in a decade we can answer that question, that we can take them. It was a miscalculation. How much margin do we have? How many years does the United States and its allies have to get their act together if we're going to be able to field the kind of capabilities, intellectual thinking, and technologies to deter countries that are moving very, very rapidly to develop specific capabilities to undermine us?
Yeah, set numbers are always a dangerous thing to lock onto, but I think it's important that we begin to move now. I look at some of the technological areas, particularly where China is playing, and I would say that within a decade, the chance of being overtaken in some critical capabilities is very real, and that's why we have to start now. But further to your question about, are we ready? I think it's important, and we point out in the report that you can't just fixate on the systems and the hardware. You also have to think in terms of how ready is that force. What are the expendables that you have in your magazines that are going to move quickly? How quickly are you able to move the things that you're going to need into the regions where conflict could occur, but more importantly, where you want to deter? So those are the things that also need to be in the calculus. But we need to start now. That was the intent of the report. We didn't try to use shocking language. We, as a group of professionals, wanted to be as frank and as open as possible. And it's important, too, that not just the policy community understands and debates this. It's important for the American people to understand that the nature of warfare is changing, that the environments in which our forces will operate in the future are not the same as we have been dealing with in the Middle East for the last 18 years. It's a very different world that we will face, and we have to be prepared for it.
We have been telling our forces that they're the best for decades. And there are a lot of Americans who believe we do have the best forces in the world. Why do they need more money? That was one of the criticisms made of your report, was that it was financial independent, right, or unconstrained by resources. Although you guys deal with that in the report, what I want to ask you, Ambassador Edelman, is you made a very, very powerful statement about what's at stake for not making this investment and not getting it right on this cycle, and that we're not going to have a couple of do-overs on this. Talk to us about what's at stake and how the American people should think fundamentally about what could be imperial exhaustion, right? I mean, the American era has been very successful, but what's at stake by not investing in these kind of capabilities?
Well, what lies behind your question, Vago, is I think the question of international order, and the order in particular that the United States both created and has sustained since 1945. It's an order based on alliances with countries both in Europe and in Asia, and relationships with countries in the Middle East. It's based on an open trading order and maintenance of freedom of the seas, freedom of airspace, and it's been not without its flaws. It's had plenty of flaws, but it's also presided over a period of essentially great power, peace, and growing prosperity that's lifted 1 billion people out of absolute poverty, and the greatest period of prosperity in the history of the world. So the question is, if you want to maintain that order, what does it take to do that? And that underpins this national defense strategy, because it says we have to maintain a balance of power that's favorable to the United States and deter conflict in the Far East and in Europe and in the Middle East, although we're going to take some more risk in the Middle East in order to meet these challenges of competition with Russia and China. My basic point is that if we want to do that, we have to be honest about what that costs, and we have to be willing to pay that price, whether that means looking at the revenue picture or looking at reforming entitlements. I think we have to do both in order to afford it. We're a very wealthy country. We've spent a lot more on, as a percentage of our GDP on defense in the past, so we can afford, I think, what it takes to do this if we make some hard choices and do the right things. The risk of not doing it is that we pretend that we have the capability to maintain these balances of power around the world when we're not actually making the investments we need to do it, and we get caught out by an adversary who recognizes that we're essentially relying on a strategy of bluff, and I think that's a very dangerous place for the country to be.
Admiral Roughead, you were Chief of Naval Operations, but a first-order military thinker. It's what you spend a large part of your day doing now, as you have throughout your career. Where do you think the United States has to place its bets? There's a tendency that we have that we continue to do things because we do them, not because technology may have dramatically changed some of those equations. There's a very robust debate about the future of the carrier and how this should be used. That was something that you grappled and dealt with as well. And I do have a carrier-specific question in a moment. But talk to us a little bit about how we need to think about what the future warfare environment looks like. And does the United States have to go away from the one-third, one-third, one-third to say, hey, you know what, it's the Air Force, for example, and nuclear submarines that terrifies our adversaries. We are going to focus on some of those systems to put real pressure on them, as opposed to a lot of the other capabilities that we've built that frankly doesn't tend to give them pause at all.
I completely agree. We have to think in a more sophisticated and a more nuanced way about how we want to shape a force for a very different future. And the one-third, one-third, one-third is not the way to do it. And I think that also plays on Eric's point about the budget. We have to think about how the defense budget is shaped in order to be able to convincingly articulate how defense plays in the bigger fiscal picture of the country. I think it is also important that we look at how we can more quickly move to some of the technologies that will be in play in the future. And that requires adjustment to our processes, to regulation, indeed to the role of Congress and how they exercise oversight over the department. So I do think that we have to get away from the cookie cutter. But we have to be able to articulate why that redistribution is optimum for the way ahead.
And you made the point that China has become more America-like as America has become more China-like in its agility.
Exactly. The time it takes for us to introduce new systems is far too long in the world in which we live in today. China is doing things very differently. Do they incur more risk? Do they sustain more failures? Likely. But that is not a bad thing. It's important that we step back and look at how are we doing things, and are we more focused on the process, or are we more focused on the outcome? And I would argue today we're more worried about adhering to a process than delivering an outcome that we need.
Do you think that Goldwater Nichols was done, and this is for both of you, Goldwater Nichols was done because there's the civil military component that I'd like you, Ambassador Edelman, to talk about, because all of the investment has tended not to go into the civilians, but actually to uniforms. How much of a problem was Goldwater Nichols, right? It was designed to solve a jointness problem that we have, but then put more bulk, more staffs, disconnected the services to a degree. Does that system almost entirely have to be scrapped, or how would you reform it in this context to try to get that agility? Because now there are, everybody sees themselves as a chief, and that diminishes the actual chiefs who are trying to, I know, having covered this very closely, the enormous frustrations you felt, even as the CNO of the Navy, to drive change within the Navy.
Right. I would say that Goldwater Nichols has delivered to the country the most effective fighting force that we have had. That said, that there are some consequences of Goldwater Nichols that are not helpful. And I believe that any program or any initiative, after 25 or 30 years, you should take a look at it, because the world has changed, circumstances have changed, and Goldwater Nichols should be looked at still with the objective of a more integrated joint force, but making sure that we have not hurt ourselves in other areas with regard to the civilian-military balance, with regard to the operational competencies that we're going to require in the future, sacrificing those in order to get people the joint credit for promotion. So I think, if I could make one recommendation, that Congress really should take a look at Goldwater Nichols, the consequences, the objectives, and then how it should be reformed going forward.
Ambassador Edelman?
Well, I largely agree with that. I know that this was something that was very much on Senator McCain's mind in the last 2 years that he was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So it's certainly worth, I think, taking a look. And I am increasingly persuaded by Gary's point that Goldwater Nichols bears some of the responsibility for the imbalance we see in civil-military relationships, in which we highlight in the report. This has been a long time developing. It's an institutional problem. It's not a personality problem. It's not got to do with the people who are running the Department of Defense today, whether it's Secretary Mattis or General Dunford or the service chiefs or any of those folks. This is really about both the growth of staffs, the competencies of staffs, the weight that they carry in internal debates, and the persistent problems we have in staffing the civilian side, some of which is a function of our political partisanship and polarization that have sort of obstructed the ability of successive administrations to adequately staff the civilian complement in the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
But if I may, one question, right? I mean, you devoted your life to national security at the State Department and one of America's most distinguished diplomats, but you split your time between going into the DOD and then ultimately becoming the policy chief of the Pentagon after having served distinguished ambassadorial posts, including in Turkey, which was a challenging assignment. And yet, many years ago, you and I were talking why you got your PhD when you did, because you said, as a civilian going into the State Department, you were never going to get any time to ever do that ever again unless you came in with it. Whereas military people have an opportunity to continually get education. And then an unfortunate talking point with some members of Congress and politicians are that government is bad and government civilians are somehow shiftless, lazy people. Full disclosure, my mother was a consular officer at the State Department, and I found her neither shiftless nor lazy and exceptionally hardworking along with the rest of the team there. But talk to us a little bit about investment in civilians and how important that is, and why it's time really to maybe shelve some of this rhetoric, because it's the greatest military in the world because of uniformed people, but also dedicated civilians who are helping every day, working every day.
It's true, and it's one of the other underlying parts of this problem of civil-military imbalance, which is that when I came in as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and started getting the first briefings on the organization as it was, I was astonished at as office after office came in and said, here's our complement, here's how it's staffed, that the number of permanent professional staff was very small compared to IPAs and contractors and people who, a lot of these offices were being held together by kind of baling wire and scotch tape and paper clips, and you didn't have the the permanent, and that had to do with hiring freezes, budget cuts, uncertain funding, the up and down nature of things. We also, despite earlier efforts by some of my former colleagues in OSD, very meritorious efforts, there really wasn't a kind of career progression for civilians in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And my then Deputy Ryan Henry and I tried to, and Ryan did a lot on this, to try and develop more of a opportunity for rotational assignments inside the Office of the Secretary of Defense, overseas assignments in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, so you could build a kind of cadre of permanent civilian officials who are there to, to serve the political appointee masters. Some of that succeeded better than other undertakings, but again, the budgetary pressures, the downward pressures, including on things like the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which is a very important way of bringing young civilians into the Office of Secretary of Defense, has been, I think, a persistent problem that needs to be addressed. So I completely agree with you.
And if I could just add to that, I think that in the world that we live in today, and will for the foreseeable future, the idea that a government civilian who will be dealing with nuclear policy, information technology policy, acquisition, the fact that they are not afforded an opportunity to go off for advanced degrees and the time to become truly expert in those areas, to me, is very irresponsible. We invest, to your point, very heavily in military education, but we owe it to have a cadre of civilian leaders and practitioners who are really schooled in what we are asking them to do. To have that not be part of a civilian government career, in my mind, is irresponsible and unfair to the individuals. And guess what? It will not attract the best and the brightest. And so I think that's an area that really needs to be thought through.
A quick, I know your time is short, and I've got two more questions, but I just want to ask a quick talent management question. You both mentioned the economy. You, sir, in particular, in your talk, talked about the challenge of recruiting, right? That at the time of the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which matched your tenure, you were able to get a ready supply of reserve manpower, for example. But one of the challenges that you raised, Ambassador, was, in a hot running economy, even though there's a sense that there's a downturn coming, it may get hard. And then there are societal reasons that Dr. Cohen added, that, for example, Google employees may be more willing to work with China than work with the Pentagon, which creates, certainly from an artificial intelligence and a big data standpoint, some challenges. How does the whole ecosystem need to think about talent and talent management? Because if you're finding military families becoming sort of that silver class that always provide the increasingly multi-generational military families, but you're not getting any of that fresh, innovative thinking, you've got a real problem, whether it's going into the civilian side of the business or uniforms.
No, you're exactly right, and I worry about this necking down of the input into the America's military, and it can become very insular. I think it's important that the government and industry, government and academia, look at ways to bridge that gap, to show young people the opportunities and indeed the obligation and the rewards that come from serving in our government, whether in uniform or as a civilian. So I think that is something that must be done. There was a time when that was the model that we followed. I think it's also important that we look perhaps at different arrangements where people from the government can be interned or serve in an adjunct capacity in industry. There will be some industries that will seek to have that, and I think that cross-pollination is very beneficial.
You know, I would just add one thing. We draw attention in the report. It's not a major finding, but it is a finding that we need to think about the sustainability of the all-volunteer force because of the declining propensity to serve and the declining ability of 18-year-olds in the United States to serve for health reasons, obesity being one major part of that. But also, if you think about what Gary has said and some of the questions you've asked, Vago, about new technologies coming in, the kinds of technological innovations that are going to be brought into our weapon systems, whether it's artificial intelligence, autonomy, robotics, quantum computing, quantum communications, all of these things are going to require a much more highly educated workforce. And so the question of our national educational system, and Gary and I have had multiple conversations about this, is really a fundamental issue of national security in a way that we probably haven't thought about it since the National Defense Education Act that was passed in the aftermath of Sputnik. And we've had discussions about whether we need a kind of Sputnik moment here to make people realize that this is a very, very important part of the country's future national security.
We're getting the hook. As much as I'm enjoying this conversation, let me ask a capability question and then a broader alliance question, because I think it's agreed, and the report makes clear. I had a nuclear question asked, but that's dealt with in the report, the importance of having a revitalized nuclear arsenal, although I may fold it into the question I have from an alliance management standpoint. But sir, from a capabilities development standpoint, you were the chief of naval operations, and several of your successors, for example, have tried to equip aircraft carriers with longer range air wings. You know, Jerry Hendricks has written about this, but the big deck aircraft carrier arose to project strategic air power at sea. And our ships are the greatest warships ever built in history, to a degree of precision of a Swiss watch, but able to deliver incredible effects out there. But only so long as the air wing is tailored to do that. Is the Navy moving fast enough to have that kind of relevance? Because there is a concern, including some very senior people at the Navy, that it's an iconic weapon system that does not have the effects it needs to be able to deliver over the long term, and becomes a potential vulnerability where if you actually sink one, it's the collapse of an edifice. The edifice of American military superiority goes with it. What has to happen about thinking differently about equipping capability, not just for the carrier, but for the military force as a whole? You know, where should the focus of investment be if you have a limited amount of resources to do it?
And my view is that there needs to be very rapid movement to long-range, unmanned, autonomous strike. That is what will maintain relevance for the aircraft carrier going forward. The carriers are going to be important. I could even argue more important to get into some of the areas where we will have to project power, because the reach of our adversaries will negate the shore bases that are there. You know, people always talk about the aircraft carrier. At least we can move it. We can't move the airfields that are proximate to the areas of operation, but we have to move quickly. That, in my view, is entirely possible. I believe that we have licked the technical problem. The policy issues will follow. It's a cultural issue, and in my view, that I've held for a long time, that the future of the aircraft carrier will hinge on unmanned, autonomous, deep strike.
And what are the other two weapon systems you'd invest in?
I would maintain our dominance in the undersea with our submarines, but using submarines also to be the mothership for autonomous underwater vehicles that expand the reach of that weapon system.
And Ambassador Edelman, we talked a lot about alliances and the importance of them. Those are now under pressure. We even have France and Germany concerned about the American security guarantees. We discussed that could be a good thing or potentially not a good thing as they stand up a European army. But talk to us more broadly about the importance of alliance in developing our future military strategies, and what are the potential implications that if the United States, which is a security guarantor for 40 countries, is not there for them, what the potential global effects of that sort of an abrogation becomes if by circumstance or a lack of investment we find ourselves?
Well, our alliances are a fundamental part of the national defense strategy that we were examining in our report. But as I said earlier, they've been a fundamental part of the international order that we created and operated after the Second World War. So they're fundamental to what we do. And although there's a lot of discussion about burden sharing, and we were just talking about whether a European army would contribute or not contribute to more to burden sharing, the burden has to also be disaggregated because the benefits we get from our allies are not purely financial. This is not totally a financial transaction, although obviously we would like them all to spend more on defense and develop more defense capability. It's also about giving us access to these theaters, bases, support, and other forms as well. So it's absolutely an essential part of what we do. What will happen if the U.S. security guarantee goes away? You can already see some signs of it. People will start acting on their own. They will start to try and defend themselves in the absence of a U.S. security guarantee. And what I can tell you for sure is they will do things we don't like. And they will probably do things we think are ill-considered and maybe self-defeating. And you see some of that going on in the Middle East, for instance, with the Saudis in Yemen. And so the importance of the security guarantee, I think, cannot be understated. It's also, frankly, a way of precluding further nuclear proliferation, and that's been a part of our grand strategy since 1945 as well. If left to their own devices, more and more countries ultimately will say, well, what's the ultimate weapon that we have to defend ourselves? We need to have our own nuclear force.
You mentioned nuclear proliferation. How important, in sort of 15 seconds from each of you, about the revitalization of not just the nuclear infrastructure and systems, given how our potential adversaries are talking about them, but also a revitalization in nuclear strategic thinking and wargaming very accurately how nuclear, there are friends of mine who say we go to a couple of days in sort of a conventional conflict without it going nuclear, where chances are it's going to go nuclear much faster, which is something as a junior officer you had a lot of experience with, given that tactical nuclear weapons were in the surface force as well.
I think it ought to be a source of satisfaction to the American public that what you mention is in fact true, which is that in wargaming it is very difficult to get people to go nuclear. That's a good thing when one thinks about it. And I think it speaks to the general abhorrence people have about using these weapons of incredible destructive power. The challenge we face is that as we get further and further away from a time when people witnessed atmospheric nuclear tests. I mean, I think Andy Marshall may be one of the last people alive who actually witnessed a atmospheric nuclear test. People use nuclear threats, I'm thinking of President Putin, for instance, much more loosely than they did in the past. And the thing I fear is, absent a really robust nuclear deterrent, tempting someone to think that they might actually be able to use these weapons in a militarily effective way, which I think would be very dangerous.
Admiral Roughead?
No, I agree, and I think the importance of recapitalization obviously key, but the point that you raise is also important, is that we have to have people who are thinking deeply about the policy, about deterrence, about consequences, and we have gotten away from that, and I think that we would all like to put the genie back in the bottle. That does not appear to be on the horizon, and so we have to have deep thinkers. We also have to have an arsenal that is modernized for the future and is that deterrent force that it's intended to be.
Admiral Gary Roughead, former Chief of Naval Operations with the Hoover Institution, now of the august Stanford University, Ambassador Eric Edelman, former Pentagon Policy Chief, and with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, co-chairs of the National Defense Strategy Commission. It was a real honor talking to both of you. Thank you very, very much, and hope you guys have a terrific holiday season.
Same to you, Vago.
Thank you, Vago. Likewise.